Hi there, beautiful soul. Welcome back to Stories Always, where every tale is a journey of the heart. How have you been since our last story? Grab a cup of tea and settle in, because this one is going to move you. If you've ever wondered whether love can still surprise you in a world full of judgment, then don't just listen, feel this one. And hey, if this story stirs your heart in any way, please like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that prove kindness still wins. Because of the love you have shown me, I want to pray for you. Lord, protect my viewers and their families. Keep them safe, guide their steps, and surround them with your love. Let them feel your covering wherever they go. Meet them right where they are. Provide for their needs, whether emotional, spiritual, or financial. Be their provider. For anyone watching who is hurting in their body, mind, or heart, I pray healing over your life. May God restore you, comfort you, and hold you close. Even if your situation feels hopeless, may you see a light at the end of the tunnel. You are not forgotten. Better days are coming. Amen. You type Amen in the comments section and also let me know where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's begin. The last truly peaceful moment of Ilara's life tasted of lukewarm coffee and smelled of old paper. She was in her own small corner of the world, a cramped but sunlit office overlooking a bustling city street. This was the headquarters of the Sparrow Initiative, the literacy foundation she had built from a passionate idea into a thriving nonprofit. Here, surrounded by towering stacks of donated books and the earnest, chaotic energy of her two-person staff, Ilara was not Mrs. Julian Dubois, appendage to a dynasty. She was just Ilara, the architect of something small but good. She swirled the dregs in her ceramic mug, a gift from a student, its lopsided rim a comforting imperfection against her lips. Her eyes scanned the grant proposal on her screen, her mind effortlessly untangling convoluted sentences and spotting budgetary inconsistencies. This was her language, her battlefield, logic, empathy, and the quiet, fierce belief that a story could save a soul. "We're going to get this one, Ilara," said Maya, her young, perpetually optimistic program coordinator, leaning against the doorframe. "The Patterson grant? It's ours. I can feel it." Ilara smiled, a genuine, unburdened expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "From your lips to the foundation god's ears, Maya. But let's not celebrate until the check is cashed. Now, did you remember to attach the updated testimonials? Printed, signed, and scanned. You taught me well." It was this easy camaraderie, this sense of shared purpose that grounded her. It was a world away from the Dubois estate, a place of opulent, echoing silence where value was measured in stock prices and bloodlines, not in the number of children who learned to read. On her desk, next to a wilting but time seemed to warp in the hour that followed, seconds stretched into agonizing, elastic minutes as Ilara moved through the motions of preparing for her own execution. She felt strangely detached, as if she were watching a film about a woman who looked like her. This woman showered, the water scalding hot, trying to scrub away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. This woman stood before the vast walk-in closet, a space Julian had proudly called her kingdom, and stared at the row of clothes she had curated to fit the mold of a Dubois wife. Elegant, understated, and utterly devoid of the vibrant colors she truly loved. Her hand, moving with a will of its own, slid past silks and cashmeres until it found the dress, the navy sheath. It was made of a heavy, unforgiving crepe that allowed for no vulnerability, no imperfection. The neckline was high, finished with a small, tasteful row of seed pearls. It was a suit of armor designed to convey propriety and unshakable poise. Genevieve had chosen it for her years ago, a welcome to the family gift that felt more like a uniform. Wearing it always made Ilara feel like she was playing a part. Tonight, the part was of the woman who would accept her fate with quiet dignity. She slipped it on. The fabric was cold against her skin. She sat at her vanity, the polished wood reflecting a stranger's face. The woman in the mirror had pale, drawn skin and wide, dark eyes that held a universe of shock. She didn't bother with makeup. What was the point of artifice now? The truth, in all its brutal ugliness, was coming for her. She clasped the single-strand pearl necklace around her throat. It felt less like an accessory and more like a collar. The drive to the country club was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Julian sat behind the wheel of his sleek, dark Mercedes, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The air in the car was thick with unspoken words, with regret so dense it was almost a physical presence. Ilara stared out the passenger window, watching the manicured lawns and towering mansions of Northgate blur into an indifferent streak of wealth and power. She kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her posture ramrod straight. To slouch, to weep, to show any sign of weakness felt like a concession she was not willing to make. Not yet. Julian cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "Ilara," he began, his voice raspy, "whatever happens tonight, whatever they say, I need you to know." "Know what, Julian?" she asked, her gaze remaining fixed on the passing scenery. "That you're sorry? I know you are. But sorry doesn't change the fact that there's a woman in our house who is measuring it for new curtains." The words landed with their intended cruelty. He flinched, a sharp, jerky movement. "It's not that simple." "It feels remarkably simple to me," she said, her voice devoid of heat, a cold, flat tundra of pain. "A choice was made. You chose them, or you failed to choose me. In the end, it amounts to the same thing." He didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The rest of the drive passed in a silence that was heavier than any argument could ever be. The Northgate Country Club was the apex of the Dubois world. It was a sprawling, colonial-style fortress of old money and older secrets, its white columns gleaming under the soft glow of landscape lighting. Valets in crisp red jackets rushed to open their doors. The air smelled of damp earth, expensive perfume, and generational power. As they walked up the stone steps, Ilara felt 100 pairs of eyes on them. They were a known quantity here, the golden couple, the future of the Dubois dynasty. She could feel the whispers, the curious glances. She held her head high, her neck stiff, and walked beside the man who was leading her to the gallows. They were not led to the main dining room with its boisterous, chattering crowd. Instead, the maitre d', a man with a perpetually somber expression, escorted them down a quiet, wood-paneled hallway to a private dining room, the Burgundy Room. It was reserved for the most important, most discreet of gatherings. The moment the door opened, the scene was exactly as she had pictured it. It was a tableau of power, perfectly arranged. Richard Dubois sat at the head of the large circular table, a silent, imposing mountain in a dark suit. He did not look up when they entered, his attention fixed on the heavy silver fork he was turning over and over in his large hands. Genevieve was seated to his right, her posture immaculate, a faint, triumphant smile playing on her lips. And to her right, seated as if she had always belonged there, was Isabel Henderson. She was wearing a simple, brutally expensive black dress. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, revealing a pair of diamond earrings that glittered like cruel, tiny stars. She looked up as they entered, and her face arranged itself into an expression of polite sympathy. It was the most insulting look Ilara had ever received. It was the look of a victor pitying the vanquished. There were only 5 place settings. The realization hit Ilara with the force of a physical blow. There was no pretense here, no gentle easing into the news. This was an amputation, and the surgeons were not concerned with bedside manner.
Julian stopped dead in the doorway, his hand instinctively reaching for Ilara's arm. But she sidestepped him, a small, sharp movement of refusal. She would not be steadied by him. She would face this on her own 2 feet. "Good evening," Ilara said, her voice emerging clear and steady, a small miracle. Richard finally looked up. His eyes, a paler gray than Julian's, were flat and dismissive. He gave a curt nod. "Ilara, Julian, you're late." "My apologies, Father," Julian mumbled, moving to the empty chair beside Isabel. The seating arrangement was a deliberate, calculated cruelty. Julian was placed between the 2 women, a visual representation of his divided loyalties and ultimate choice. Ilara was left to take the final seat, directly opposite her husband, next to Richard. She was isolated, placed under the watchful, oppressive gaze of the patriarch. She sat down, her back straight, and placed her small clutch on the table. She smoothed the napkin in her lap, her movements slow and deliberate. It was a strange, out-of-body calm, the kind that descends in the heart of a disaster. The room was silent, the only sound the faint, distant clinking of silverware from the world outside their closed door.
A waiter appeared as if summoned by telepathy, pouring water into crystal goblets. No one spoke. The tension in the room was a living entity, coiling and tightening with each passing second. Ilara met Julian's eyes across the table. He looked wrecked, his face a mask of misery and guilt. He wouldn't look at her for more than a second, his gaze skittering away to a point on the wall just over her shoulder. He couldn't bear to see the pain he was causing. It was Genevieve who finally broke the silence, her voice slicing through the tension like a shard of glass. "Well," she began, placing her hands on the table, her rings glittering in the low light, "I suppose there is no sense in delaying the inevitable with meaningless pleasantries." She looked directly at Ilara, her expression devoid of any emotion save a cool, detached satisfaction. "The family has decided that it is time for a change. Julian's marriage to you, Ilara, has run its course. It is no longer advantageous." The word hung in the air. Advantageous. It was the language of business, of mergers and acquisitions. It was not the language of love, of a decade of shared life, of whispered promises in the dark. Ilara did not flinch. She did not gasp. She simply held Genevieve's gaze, her own eyes dark and unreadable. She felt a strange, cold strength flowing into her. They expected tears. They expected a scene. She would give them nothing. Julian made a small, strangled sound, a half-formed protest that died in his throat. His father, Richard, shot him a look of pure, undiluted warning. It was a look that said, "Be silent. This is done." Genevieve continued, her voice gaining strength as she delivered the killing blow. "Therefore, it has been decided that you and Julian will divorce. The arrangements have already been made by our legal team. They are, you will find, generous but firm." She gestured subtly with her head toward Isabel. "Julian requires a partner who is better suited to the demands and the profile of his future role as CEO. Isabel has graciously agreed to step into that role." The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it was breathtaking. To be told not only that her marriage was over, but that her replacement was sitting right there, a pre-selected, board-approved upgrade? The room swam for a moment, the edges of her vision blurring. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. The wood felt solid, real, an anchor in the dizzying vortex of their words. She turned her head slowly to look at Isabel. The younger woman met her gaze, that mask of polite sympathy still firmly in place. "Ilara," Isabel said, her voice a soft, honeyed whisper of poison,
I hope you understand. This is nothing personal. It's about what is best for the family, for the legacy. Nothing personal? Ilara finally spoke, and her voice was a marvel. It did not tremble. It was low, resonant, and laced with a contempt so pure it was almost elegant. You are sitting at my table, discussing the end of my marriage with my husband and his parents, and you tell me it is nothing personal? A flicker of surprise crossed Isabel's perfect face. She had not expected to be challenged. It is a matter of practicalities, Richard rumbled, speaking for the first time. His voice was like gravel grinding together. It was the voice of finality. Dubois Holdings is entering a critical phase of global expansion. We need a united front, a seamless public image. Your background, your independent projects. He waved a dismissive hand, as if her foundation, her entire life's work, was a piece of lint to be brushed away. They create a narrative that is not aligned with our corporate strategy. The cold corporate jargon was more dehumanizing than any insult. She was not a wife, a partner, a person. She was a narrative. And she was being written out of the story. Ilara turned her gaze to the only person in the room who mattered. She looked at Julian. He was staring down at his plate, at the pristine, untouched bread roll, as if it held the secrets to the universe. Julian, she said, and his name was the only word she allowed to hold the weight of her shattered heart. He looked up, and she saw it all in his eyes. The agony, the shame, the profound, gut-wrenching weakness. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own cowardice. Ilara, he started, his voice a choked whisper. I love you. I swear I do. But, You can't what? She pressed, her voice sharp now, demanding. You can't fight for your own wife? You can't stand up to them for once in your life? You can't honor the vows you made to me?
The vows were a youthful folly, Genevieve interjected smoothly, waving away a decade of marriage like it was a bad investment. We all make mistakes. The key is to rectify them efficiently. The word efficiently was the final snap. Something inside Ilara, something that had been holding on by a single frayed thread, broke. But it did not break into tears. It broke into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She stood up. Her chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound unnaturally loud, a screech of protest in the funereal calm. All eyes snapped to her. She looked down at the four of them, the architect of her pain, the silent executioner, the usurper, and the coward. They were a perfect, monstrous unit. She did not raise her voice. She did not scream. She spoke in a tone that was eerily calm, a quiet that was more terrifying than any rage. You are right, Genevieve, she said, her eyes locking with her mother-in-law's. It is time to rectify mistakes. She let her gaze travel over Richard's impassive face, Isabel's feigned sympathy, and finally land on Julian's broken expression. My mistake was believing that love could flourish in a place where it is treated as a commodity. It was believing that loyalty would be returned. It was believing that my worth was something that could be granted to me by this family. She picked up her clutch from the table. You don't have to worry about your lawyers or your generous settlement. I don't want your money. I don't want anything that has been touched by the sickness in this family. She turned to Julian. I pity you, she said, and the words were delivered with a devastating finality. You have everything, and you are nothing. You've allowed them to hollow you out and fill you with their ambition. I hope it keeps you warm at night. And with that, she turned her back on them. She walked to the door, her steps even and unhurried. She did not look back. She could feel their stunned silence behind her, a palpable wave of shock. They had expected hysterics, pleading, a messy, emotional scene they could control. They had not expected this. This quiet, dignified defiance. This absolute rejection of their power. She pulled the door open and stepped out into the hallway, pulling it shut behind her. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a cage opening. She walked down the long, empty corridor, past the portraits of long-dead Dubois ancestors who stared down at her with cold, painted eyes. She walked past the chattering, oblivious diners in the main hall. She walked out of the heavy front doors, into the cool, clean night air. She did not wait for the valet. She did not want their car. She walked down the long, winding driveway, her sensible heels clicking on the asphalt. A light drizzle began to fall, cold and sharp against her face, mingling with the single hot tear that finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of fury, of release. They thought they had taken everything from her. They thought they had erased her. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. They had taken Ilara Dubois, the compliant wife. But they had just given birth to Ilara, the woman who had nothing left to lose. And she would, quietly, take back everything she had ever given them, and more. The walk from the country club was 3 miles. 3 miles in the cold, persistent drizzle, her totally inadequate pearl-adorned dress clinging to her skin. Each step was a tiny rebellion. Each raindrop that slicked her hair to her scalp felt like a baptism, washing away a decade of compromise. Her feet, already sore from the impractical heels, began to blister, but the sharp, rhythmic pain was a welcome distraction. It was real. It was physical. It was something she could focus on, other than the gaping, cavernous hole that had been torn open in her life. By the time she reached the gates of the Dubois estate, she was a wreck, a sodden, shivering mess of navy crepe and shattered illusions. The house loomed before her, its windows blazing with a cold, indifferent light. For a moment she faltered. This was still, legally, her home. Her books were on the shelves, her clothes in the closet, the ghost of her laughter still clinging to the air. But it was a haunted house now, occupied by the specter of her failed marriage. She didn't have a key. Her house keys were in her car, which was still sitting in the country club parking lot. Julian would have his. She could wait. She could huddle by the door like a beggar, waiting for her husband, her ex-husband, to come home and formally evict her. The thought was so humiliating it sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through her veins. No, she would not wait. She walked around the side of the house, her heels sinking into the soft, wet grass of the perfectly manicured lawn. She went to the back, to the flagstone patio off the rarely used sunroom. Tucked away behind a large terracotta planter holding a dead fern, a small act of defiance she'd never had the heart to dispose of, was a spare key. It was her key, one she'd had made years ago, a secret she'd never shared with Genevieve. A tiny piece of this fortress that was hers alone. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the lock. The door swung open into the silent, dark room. She stepped inside, dripping onto the pristine Italian tile. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved through the ground floor of the house like a phantom, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. The living room was empty, the peacock blue curtains looking garish and out of place in the gloom. It was a crime scene. She could almost see the chalk outline of her life on the floor. Upstairs, she moved with grim purpose. She ignored their bedroom, the bed where she had slept beside a stranger, and went instead to the guest suite at the far end of the hall. She stripped off the wet, hateful dress, leaving it in a heap on the floor like a shed skin. She took another scalding shower, this time not to wash away the chill, but to feel something, anything other than the icy numbness in her chest. Wrapped in a thick, impersonal guest towel, she walked into the master closet. She didn't look at Julian's side, at the neat rows of tailored suits and starched shirts. She went to her own. With methodical, dispassionate efficiency, she began to pack. Not the Dubois-approved wardrobe of beiges and navies. She packed the things that were truly hers. Her worn collection of novels, the lopsided mug from her student, her old, comfortable jeans and oversized sweaters, the silver-framed photo from Lisbon. She took the small wooden bird from the vanity and wrapped it carefully in a wool scarf, placing it in the very bottom of her suitcase. She packed one bag, a single, battered suitcase that had seen her through college. It was all she needed. It was all that was truly hers. As she was zipping it shut, she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel outside, the low thrum of the Mercedes engine cutting out. Then the sound of a car door, followed by another. He hadn't come home alone. She stood motionless in the middle of the room, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She heard the front door open and close. Voices from the foyer, low and urgent. Julian's and a woman's. Isabel's. The sound of Isabel's voice in this house, tonight, was a violation so profound it made her sick. They hadn't even waited a day. They hadn't even had the decency to let her body grow cold before the vultures descended. This was not just a divorce. It was a hostile takeover of her life. "Julian, this is madness," Isabel was saying, her voice carrying up the grand staircase. "You should have let the driver handle her. Leaving her at the club, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking she's my wife." Julian's voice was raw, ragged with a pain that Ilara, to her own disgust, still felt a pang of sympathy for. "Was. My wife. I couldn't just have her escorted out like a trespasser." "That's exactly what she is now," a third voice said. Genevieve, of course. The Queen had come to survey her new territory. "And you, Julian, need to start thinking like a Dubois. Sentiment is a liability we cannot afford. Now, where is she?" Ilara picked up her suitcase. She walked out of the bedroom and stood at the top of the stairs. The three of them stood in the foyer below, a perfect tableau of power and betrayal. Genevieve, regal and cold. Isabel, looking concerned in that expertly practiced way of hers. And Julian, standing between them, looking utterly broken. A man torn apart by his own weakness. They all looked up at the same time. Ilara, standing there with her single suitcase, her face pale and composed, her wet hair clinging to her neck, must have been a shocking sight. She was a ghost at her own funeral, and she was refusing to lie down. "There you are," Genevieve said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Making a scene, as usual." "I was just leaving," Ilara said, her voice calm. She started down the stairs, her steps measured and even. She kept her eyes fixed on Julian. "I just came to get my things." "Your things?" Genevieve let out a short, sharp laugh. "My dear, everything in this house belongs to this family. The clothes on your back were paid for by Dubois money." "You can have the clothes," Ilara said, stopping on the last step so she was almost level with them. "You can have the jewelry. You can have the cars. You can have this cold, empty house. I'm just taking what's mine." She held up the battered suitcase. "My memories. They don't have a price tag." Julian took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Ilara, please, don't do this. We can talk about this. In the morning, we can be civilized." "Civilized?" Ilara looked from his anguished face to Isabel's placid one. Was it civilized to audition my replacement in my own living room? Was it civilized to announce the end of my 10-year marriage over a bread roll? I think your family's definition of civilized is different from mine. Mine involves a shred of human decency. Isabel actually had the audacity to look hurt. "That's not fair. This is difficult for all of us." Ilara almost laughed. The sheer, unmitigated gall of the woman was almost impressive. "Is it difficult for you, Isabel? It doesn't seem so. It seems you've landed the role of a lifetime. Try not to redecorate too quickly. The paint might not stick to the walls while the blood is still wet." Isabel recoiled, her mask of composure finally cracking. Genevieve stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "That is enough. You have been treated more than fairly. Our lawyers drafted a severance package that is extraordinarily generous. It will allow you to live very comfortably. All it requires is your discretion and your signature." "A severance package," Ilara repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You speak of my marriage as if it were a job I've been fired from." "In essence," Genevieve said coolly, "a position with certain responsibilities which you are no longer suited to fulfill. Sign the papers, Ilara, take the money and go. Disappear, quietly. It's the most dignified option you have left." The papers? The final insult. A stack of documents that would legally erase her, binding her to silence with a golden gag. In that moment, Ilara's resistance crystallized. It was no longer just a raw emotional reaction. It became a conscious choice. She would not be erased. She would not be silenced. And she would not be bought. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it resonated in the cavernous foyer with the force of a bomb. Genevieve's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no," Ilara repeated, her gaze unflinching. "I will not sign your papers. I will not take your blood money. And I will not disappear. You wanted to end our marriage? Fine, it's ended. But you will not dictate the terms of my exit, or my life." A flicker of something, was it fear, uncertainty, crossed Genevieve's face for the first time. This was not in the script. The little librarian's daughter was not following her lines. "Don't be a fool," Genevieve hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You are declaring war on this family, a war you cannot possibly win. We will bury you in legal fees. We will drag your name through the mud. By the time we are done, you will have nothing." "I already have nothing," Ilara said, a strange sense of liberation washing over her. "You've seen to that, and that makes me very, very dangerous, because I have nothing left to lose." She looked at Julian one last time. His face was a canvas of pure agony. He was trapped, and he knew it. But the time for pity was over. "Goodbye, Julian," she said, and the words were truly final. She turned and walked toward the front door, pulling her suitcase behind her. The wheels rattled on the marble floor, a defiant, clattering sound in the oppressive silence. She reached the door, pulled it open, and walked out into the rain without looking back. She didn't know where she was going. She had a few $1,000s in a personal bank account, the one she fed with the meager stipend from her foundation work. She had no home, no car. Her entire support system had been systematically dismantled. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She stood on the grand, sweeping driveway, the rain soaking her again, her cheap cotton sweater providing little warmth. The fight, the adrenaline, the defiance that had carried her through the last hour began to ebb, and in its place a vast, cold ocean of despair threatened to pull her under. What had she just done? She had walked away from a fortune. She had declared war on a family with infinite resources and zero morality. Genevieve was right. They would destroy her. Just as the first real sob began to build in her throat, a pair of headlights cut through the rainy darkness, sweeping across the driveway. It wasn't a sleek Mercedes or a black pound car. It was a battered, 10-year-old Honda Civic, its engine making a faint rattling noise. It pulled up beside her, and the passenger window rolled down. It was Maya, her face etched with worry.
Ilara! Oh my God, I was so worried. I drove by the club and saw your car was still there, and I had this awful feeling. I came here. I didn't know what else to do. Get in.
Tears streamed down Alara's face, hot and cleansing. They weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. She wasn't entirely alone. She had one person, one small, flickering light in the vast darkness. She opened the back door, threw her suitcase inside, and climbed into the passenger seat. The car smelled of old coffee and cinnamon gum. The dashboard was cluttered with papers. It was the most beautiful, welcoming place she had ever been. "Are you okay?" Maya asked, her voice soft with a compassion that Alara had not felt in a decade. "No," Alara said, her voice breaking, "but I will be." Maya put the car in gear and pulled away from the grand, prison-like mansion. In the rearview mirror, Alara could see the figure of Julian standing in the open doorway, a lonely silhouette against the cold, bright light, watching her go. For a fleeting second, she felt a pang of something akin to loss. Then she turned her eyes to the road ahead, to the uncertain, terrifying, and beautifully, gloriously empty canvas of her new life. The resistance had begun. The first week of Alara's new life was a blur of logistics and quiet despair. Maya, with a loyalty that brought tears to Alara's eyes, insisted she stay in her tiny one-bedroom apartment. Alara slept on a lumpy pull-out sofa that smelled faintly of her friend's cat, a creature named Ginsberg who regarded her with deep suspicion. During the day, while Maya was at the foundation, Alara existed in a strange limbo. She would sit by the window, watching a world that she was no longer a part of, nursing a single cup of coffee for hours. The initial fiery defiance that had propelled her out of the Dubois mansion had cooled, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of reality. Genevieve's threat echoed in her mind: "We will bury you." Alara had no illusions. They would. The Dubois family's power was not just in their wealth, it was in their reach. They sat on boards, funded political campaigns, and had the city's most formidable law firm, Whitlock and Finch, on permanent retainer. She was a goldfish who had declared war on a great white shark. She spent hours online researching divorce lawyers. The top-tier firms were all impossibly expensive. The more affordable ones seemed intimidated the moment she mentioned the name Dubois. One lawyer had even hung up on her mid-sentence. They were closing ranks, freezing her out, making her a pariah before the first legal document had even been filed. This was how they operated, not with a loud declaration of war, but with a quiet, systemic strangulation. Her only refuge was the foundation. She threw herself into the work with a desperate, ferocious energy. It was the one place where her name wasn't Dubois, where her value wasn't tied to a stock portfolio. Here, she was the woman who could coax a shy second grader into reading aloud, the woman who could write a grant proposal so compelling it made hardened philanthropists open their checkbooks. It was the only part of her identity they hadn't been able to touch. A little over a week after her departure, a crisp, intimidatingly thick envelope arrived at the Foundation's small office. It was from Whitlock and Finch. Maya handed it to her with an expression of dread. "You don't have to open it now," Maya said gently. "Yes, I do," Alara replied, her voice steady. "Running from it won't make it go away." She sat at her cluttered desk and sliced open the envelope with a letter opener. Inside was not the aggressive, threatening legal filing she expected. It was a summons, a formal, legally binding request for her presence at a meeting. The subject line made her blood run cold. Regarding the operational charter of the Acorn Project subsidiary. Alara stared at the words, her mind racing. The Acorn Project. It was a name she hadn't thought of in almost 9 years. It felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, Julian was just a junior executive, eager to prove himself but overshadowed by his father's legacy. Alara, fresh from her MBA program and brimming with ideas, had been his secret weapon. The Acorn Project was her brainchild, born on their kitchen island over takeout containers and cheap wine.
It was a small, almost forgotten subsidiary of Dubois Holdings designed to invest in high-risk, innovative green technology startups. It was her passion project. She had drafted the business plan, identified the initial investment targets, and, in a fit of youthful optimism, had insisted it be structured as a semi-autonomous entity to protect it from the main board's conservative, profit-at-all-costs mindset. Richard had seen it as a pittance, a small indulgence, to keep his son and his new, bright-eyed wife busy. He'd signed the charter papers without much thought, and it had been quietly folded into the vast labyrinth of the Dubois corporate structure.
And now, nearly a decade later, it was being brought up in a legal summons. She read the document again, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. And then she saw it, the reason for the summons, the one tiny, catastrophic mistake the ruthlessly efficient Dubois legal team had made. As per the founding charter, any significant change in the operational direction or leadership of the Acorn Project subsidiary requires the unanimous consent of the original signatories. The original signatories: Richard Dubois, Julian Dubois, and Elara Mathis, her maiden name. A slow, incredulous smile spread across her face. It was the first time she had smiled in 10 days. In their haste to create a small, inconsequential sandbox for their son, they had bound her to it, not as a wife, not as a Dubois, but as a founding partner. They had overlooked it. In their world of billion-dollar deals and corporate takeovers, the tiny Acorn Project was a forgotten footnote. But a footnote, she realized, could be a foothold. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, in the main boardroom of the Dubois Holdings Tower. Forced proximity. It was a move designed to intimidate her, to remind her of the power she had walked away from. But for the first time since that horrible night, Elara felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was leverage. The Dubois Holdings Tower was a monument to corporate power, a spear of black glass and steel that pierced the city skyline. As Elara walked into the lobby, the opulence was a physical assault. The soaring, cathedral-like atrium, the hushed, reverent atmosphere, the security guards with their discreet earpieces. It was all designed to make a person feel small and insignificant. But today, Elara did not feel small. She wore her best and only blazer, a simple but well-cut black jacket she'd bought for a foundation fundraiser years ago. She'd spent her last $100 on getting her hair professionally styled. She was not the sodden, defeated woman who had fled into the rain. She was Elara Mathis, a signatory on a founding charter, and she had been summoned. She was escorted to the 40th floor by a silent assistant who refused to make eye contact. The boardroom was exactly as she remembered it, a cavernous space dominated by a gargantuan mahogany table that could seat 30. At the far end of the table, under a massive, abstract oil painting that probably cost more than her entire foundation, sat the 3 men who had orchestrated her downfall. Richard Dubois at the head, looking as immovable as a mountain. To his right, Arthur Whitlock, the family's lead counsel, a man with the cold, reptilian eyes of a predator. And to his left, Julian. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had lost weight. He sat stiffly in his chair, his gaze fixed on a point on the table in front of him. When Elara walked in, his head jerked up, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She saw a flicker of hope, of desperate longing in his gaze before he looked away, cowed by his father's presence. "Miss Mathis," Arthur Whitlock began, his voice smooth and oily. He gestured to a single, isolated chair at the opposite end of the vast table, a clear and deliberate act of distancing. "Thank you for coming." Elara ignored the indicated chair. Instead, she walked halfway down the table and chose a seat closer to the center, directly opposite Julian. A small act of defiance, but it shifted the power dynamic in the room ever so slightly. She placed her worn leather satchel on the table.
"Mr. Whitlock," she said, her voice cool and even, "my summons said this was about the Acorn Project. I assume you have something to discuss." Whitlock exchanged a glance with Richard. He had clearly expected a more timid, more intimidated woman. "Indeed. A simple matter of housekeeping. As you know, Dubois Holdings is undergoing a period of restructuring. We are divesting from several non-essential assets to streamline our portfolio. The Acorn Project is one such asset." "Divesting?" Ilara asked, feigning ignorance. "You mean you're selling it?" "Dissolving it, to be more precise," Whitlock clarified. "Its holdings will be absorbed back into the parent company. It's a standard procedure. All it requires is your signature on this document." He slid a single sheet of paper down the polished expanse of the table. It stopped a few feet from her. The dissolution agreement. Her signature would erase the last legal tie she had to the company she had helped build. Ilara didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on Julian. "The Acorn Project," she mused, as if reminiscing. "I remember when we started that. We were so excited. We thought we could change the world, even just a little piece of it." She looked directly at her estranged husband.
Do you remember that, Julian? The night we drafted the mission statement? We were drinking that terrible red wine from the corner store and eating pizza on the floor of our first apartment. Julian flinched, the memory a clear and painful strike. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I remember," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Richard Dubois shifted in his seat, a low grumble of impatience. "This is not a social gathering, Ilara. Sign the paper." Ilara finally turned her gaze to him. "No." The word, quiet and simple, hung in the air. Arthur Whitlock's smooth composure cracked. "Miss Mathis, perhaps you don't understand. This is not a negotiation. This is a formality." "It doesn't feel like a formality to me," Ilara said, leaning forward slightly. "It feels like you're trying to dissolve a subsidiary that, if my memory serves me correctly, holds the initial seed funding patents for at least 3 companies that are now at the forefront of renewable energy technology. One of which, I believe, just signed a major government contract." The silence in the room was electric. Whitlock's face was a mask of shock. Richard's eyes narrowed. They had grossly underestimated her. They had assumed she was just the wife, the emotional, flighty woman they had cast aside. They had forgotten she had an MBA. They had forgotten she had a mind like a steel trap. "Those are minor holdings," Whitlock stammered, clearly thrown off balance. "Are they?" Ilara asked, a faint, challenging smile on her lips. "I would love to see the current valuation. As a founding signatory, I believe I'm entitled to a full accounting of the subsidiary's assets and performance reports before I sign away my rights to it. I'm sure you have those documents readily available." This is where you can feel the entire balance of power shifting. A single, forgotten detail from the past can become an unbreakable key to the future. Has there ever been a moment in your life where a small, overlooked detail came back to have a major impact? Share your story in the comments. Julian was staring at her now, a look of dawning, incredulous awe on his face. He was seeing her for the first time in years, not as his wife, not as the woman who managed their social life, but as the brilliant, formidable strategist he had first fallen in love with. Richard Dubois slammed his palm flat on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Enough of these games," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "What do you want, Ilara? Money? Is that what this is about? Name your price. We will buy your signature and be done with this." This was the moment of truth. She could take the buyout. She could walk away with a fortune, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, enough to fund her foundation 100 times over. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. But Ilara wasn't interested in safety anymore. She was interested in justice.
She looked at the three powerful men who had tried to break her, who had assumed she would crumble, and she felt a surge of strength, a clarity of purpose she had never known. "I don't want your money, Richard," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "I want a meeting, a real one, with a full, transparent audit of the Acorn Project's assets. And I want my own legal counsel present." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "And I want a seat at this table. Not as a guest, not as a ghost from the past, but as a founding partner of one of your most promising and most carelessly forgotten assets." She stood up, her chair making no sound on the thick carpet. She had said her piece. She had drawn her line in the sand. "My lawyer will be in touch," she said. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't look back to see the stunned, furious face of Richard Dubois or the calculating glare of his lawyer. But she did, for a fraction of a second, glance back at Julian. He was still staring at her, his mouth slightly agape. And in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a very, very long time. It wasn't pity. It wasn't guilt. It was respect. And it was the first tiny hairline crack in the wall of his father's prison. Elara walked out of the Dubois Holdings Tower and into the bright, indifferent afternoon sun. She felt dizzy, her body thrumming with an adrenaline that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. She had done it. She had faced the dragon in its lair and had not been consumed. She had spoken her truth to power, and for a fleeting moment, power had blinked. But as she rode the crowded city bus back to Maya's apartment, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the cold, stark reality of her situation. She had made a bold declaration, but it was a bluff built on a foundation of memory and instinct.
She had no lawyer. She had no access to the full, transparent audit she had so bravely demanded. She had a single, aging document and a flicker of hope. Her first call was to a woman named Anya Sharma. Anya had been 2 years ahead of Elara in business school, a fiercely intelligent, no-nonsense firebrand who had gone on to start her own boutique law firm specializing in corporate litigation. Unlike the old money firms, Anya's practice was built on representing the underdog, the David against the Goliath. Elara hadn't spoken to her in years, but she prayed Anya would remember her. "Elara Mathis," Anya said, her voice sharp and clear over the phone. "I'll be damned. I thought you'd been swallowed whole by the Dubois monster." "They tried," Elara said, a wry smile touching her lips. "But I proved to be indigestible." She explained the situation, her voice low and urgent, huddled in the corner of Maya's living room for privacy. She told Anya everything: the humiliating dinner, the attempt to force her signature, the forgotten charter for the Acorn Project. She expected skepticism, a gentle letting down. Instead, there was a long, charged silence on the other end of the line. "Elara," Anya finally said, her voice laced with a newfound predatory excitement, "you haven't just found a foothold, you found a nuclear launch code. Do you have any idea what some of those early green tech patents are worth now? The Dubois haven't been careless, they've been arrogant. They buried an asset so deep they forgot they gave you the key to the vault." Anya agreed to take the case on contingency. The relief that washed over Elara was so profound it made her knees weak. For the first time, she wasn't alone in this fight. She had an ally. Anya's first move was to file a formal, aggressive discovery motion, legally demanding every scrap of paper related to the Acorn Project for the last 9 years. As they waited for the inevitable deluge of documents from Whitlock and Finch, Elara began her own excavation. She drove to a storage unit on the industrial side of town, a place she hadn't visited in years. It was a 10 by 10 metal box filled with the relics of her former life, the person she was before she became Mrs. Dubois. Inside, amidst dusty college textbooks and boxes of old photographs, she found it,
a large, sturdy portfolio box labeled simply MBA Final Projects. She pried it open. The air filled with the musty, sweet smell of old paper and fading ink. And there it was, nestled at the very bottom, a thick, spiral-bound report with a simple title page, The Acorn Project, a proposal for socially conscious incubation within a traditional corporate structure. She sat on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit, the single bare bulb overhead casting a harsh light, and she began to read. It was all there. Her own handwriting, neat and slanted, filled the margins with frantic, excited notes. The initial market research, the projections she'd stayed up all night to perfect, the list of the first 10 startups she had targeted for seed funding, companies that were then just a handful of engineers with a crazy idea, now industry leaders. But it was the pages at the back that made her stop breathing. Tucked into a clear plastic sleeve were several sheets of loose-leaf paper. On them, in Julian's familiar, elegant script, were notes. Notes on her proposal. He had read it, studied it, understood it on a level she hadn't even realized at the time. His comments weren't just supportive, they were brilliant. He had seen the long-term potential, the strategic value in what she was proposing. This isn't just about PR, Elara, one note read. This is about future-proofing the company. Dad will see it as a toy. I see it as the Ark. A single hot tear dripped onto the page, smudging the decade-old ink. This was the man she had married, this brilliant, insightful, passionate man who had seen her, truly seen her, and believed in her. What had happened to him? How had the weight of his father's expectations crushed that spark out of him? She saw with a devastating clarity not just what she had lost, but what he had lost. He had lost himself. She carefully packed the proposal into her satchel. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a testament. It was the ghost of the man she had loved. Meanwhile, in the sterile, soundproofed office on the 40th floor of the Dubois Tower, Julian was conducting his own archaeological dig. Ilara's defiance in the boardroom had shaken something loose in him. It was as if he'd been sleepwalking for years and had suddenly been doused with ice water. He saw her not as the source of his current problem, but as the brilliant, vibrant woman he had systematically allowed his family to diminish. The guilt was a physical, gnawing thing in his gut.
His father was furious, his mother coldly contemptuous. They saw Ilara's move as a vulgar, desperate cash grab. They were already strategizing, planning how to bury her in legal motions, how to leak damaging, untrue stories to the press, how to grind her down until she had no choice but to surrender. But Julian saw something else. He saw a fighter. And he remembered, with a pang of shame, that he used to be her partner in that fight. He started digging. He told his secretary he was reviewing old investment files, a plausible excuse. He used his COO-level clearance to access the company's digital archives, searching for every file related to the Acorn project. What he found was scant. The project had been so sidelined, so forgotten, that its records were incomplete, almost an afterthought. But then he expanded his search. He started looking for files related to the Hendersons, Isabel's family. He told himself he was just doing due diligence on the strategic alliance his father was pushing. He typed Henderson into the search bar for his father's private server, a place he was not supposed to be, a place that carried a high risk of discovery. But for the first time in his life, the fear of his father was less than the gnawing need to know the truth. He found it in a folder labeled Project Nightingale. It was a series of emails, financial analyses, and private investigator reports. The earliest one was dated 18 months ago. It was a dispassionate, chillingly detailed dossier on Isabel Henderson. Her education, her social connections, her temperament, even her fertility prospects. It was an arranged marriage, planned with the cold, strategic precision of a corporate merger. And the planning had begun long before Ilara was ever deemed no longer advantageous. He scrolled through the emails between his father and Arthur Whitlock. They discussed Isabel as an asset. They outlined a timeline for integrating her into the family, for introducing her into their social circle, for phasing Ilara out. His mother, Genevieve, was copied on every email, her replies brief, clinical, and enthusiastic. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the air driven from his lungs. This wasn't a recent decision. This wasn't a reaction to a changing business climate. This had been a long, slow, deliberate conspiracy. They hadn't just replaced Ilara, they had been grooming her replacement for over a year. All while Ilara was planning their anniversary trip, all while she was nursing him through the flu, all while she was pouring her heart and soul into supporting the very family that was plotting her obsolescence. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it was staggering. He thought back to every dinner, every holiday, every family event for the last year and a half. Every cold look from his mother, every dismissive comment from his father. It was all part of the plan. They had been gaslighting him, manipulating him, slowly turning him against his own wife without him even realizing it. And he, in his weakness and his desperate need for their approval, had let them. He printed a single damning email chain, the one that laid out the initial timeline. He folded the papers and slipped them into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. His hand was trembling. The weight of the paper felt like a lead ingot against his chest. That evening, he didn't go back to the silent, empty mansion. He didn't go to dinner with Isabel, ignoring the string of increasingly frantic texts from her and his mother. He drove, aimlessly at first, his mind a maelstrom of guilt, rage, and shame. He ended up in a part of the city he hadn't been to in years, a gritty, vibrant neighborhood of brick walk-ups and noisy bodegas. He parked his Mercedes, an alien spaceship in this world of dented Hondas, and walked. He found himself standing outside a brightly lit building with a simple sign in the window, the Sparrow Initiative. He could see the lights on in a second-floor window. He imagined her in there, surrounded by books, by purpose, by a life she had built for herself, a life that had nothing to do with him or his toxic family. He stood across the street for a long time, the folded papers in his pocket a burning accusation against his heart. He had a choice. He could retreat, go back to his gilded cage, and live with the knowledge of his family's monstrosity and his own cowardice. Or he could burn it all to the ground. He could take this proof, this poison, and deliver it to the one person who could use it as a weapon. The truth had been unveiled.
And now, armed with their respective discoveries, Ilara with the proof of her contribution, Julian with the proof of his family's betrayal, their connection was about to be tested under the weight of these hidden, painful truths. He took a deep breath and started to cross the street. The buzzer to Maya's apartment building shrieked, a jarring, angry sound that cut through the late-night quiet. Ilara, hunched over Maya's small kitchen table, looked up from the Acorn Project proposal. She was surrounded by a sea of paper, printouts of Anya's legal filings, her own handwritten notes, a half-eaten container of takeout noodles forgotten hours ago. Ginsberg the cat, her self-appointed furry supervisor, blinked slowly from his perch on a stack of books. It was almost 11 o'clock. Maya was out with friends. No one should be buzzing at this hour. Ilara's first thought was that it was a process server from Whitlock and Finch, another salvo in the legal war. Her stomach tightened. She pressed the intercom button. Hello? A burst of static, then a voice. A voice she would recognize anywhere, but it was strained, ragged, stripped of its usual confident timbre. Ilara? It's me. It's Julian. Ilara's heart did a painful, complicated somersault in her chest. A wave of emotions washed over her, anger, shock, and a treacherous, unwanted flicker of concern. What was he doing here? How had he even found her? Go away, Julian, she said, her voice harder than she felt. Please, he said, and the word was so full of desperation, so devoid of artifice, that it stopped her. Please, Ilara, I'm not here to fight. I'm not here to ask for anything. I have to show you something. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking.
Against her better judgment, against every self-preservation instinct that screamed at her to hang up, she hesitated. The raw, broken sound of his voice had bypassed her defenses. This wasn't the cowed, defeated man from the boardroom. This was someone else. She pressed the button to unlock the main door, a decision she immediately second-guessed. She stood in the middle of the small living room, her arms wrapped around herself, waiting. She heard his heavy, expensive shoes on the linoleum of the building staircase. A soft knock on the apartment door. She opened it a crack, leaving the chain on. He stood in the dim, fluorescent light of the hallway, and the sight of him stole her breath. He looked like a ghost. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, his face pale and haggard. The confident, polished veneer of Julien Dubois had been stripped away, and what was left was someone she barely recognized, someone lost and profoundly tormented. "What do you want, Julien?" she asked, her voice quiet. He didn't try to push his way in. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped. "I found something," he said, his voice low. "In my father's files. Something you need to see." He held up a small stack of folded papers. His hand was trembling. Curiosity, that most dangerous and human of traits, won out. She slid the chain off and opened the door. He stepped inside, and the tiny apartment seemed to shrink around his large frame. He looked out of place, a creature of marble foyers and sweeping vistas crammed into a world of second-hand furniture and peeling paint. His gaze swept over the room, the lumpy pull-out sofa where she slept, the stacks of books, the takeout container on the table. A look of deep, profound shame crossed his face. This was what he had reduced her to. "Thank you," he whispered. They stood in silence for a long, awkward moment. Ginsberg hopped down from his perch and wound his way around Julian's legs, sniffing at his $1,000 trousers with feline disdain, before apparently deeming him acceptable. "Here," Julian said, holding out the papers. Ilara took them. She unfolded the crisp sheets and began to read. It was the email chain, the one from 18 months ago between his father, his mother, and Arthur Whitlock, the one that laid out Project Nightingale in cold, clinical detail. She read about the strategic value of an alliance with the Hendersons. She read the dispassionate assessment of Isabel as a suitable broodmare for the Dubois dynasty. She read the casual, cruel discussion of a timeline for her own removal. The words blurred, then sharpened with a horrifying clarity. She had known they were cruel. She had known they were calculating. But this was a level of premeditated, sociopathic maneuvering that she could never have imagined. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously planned, that it was almost a work of art. She sank onto the sofa, the papers trembling in her hand. She felt strangely calm, the way a person does in the eye of a hurricane. The pain was so vast, so all-encompassing, that it had gone beyond tears. "They were planning it for almost 2 years," she said, the words a hollow whisper. "All that time, every dinner, every holiday, it was all a lie." "Yes," Julian said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Ilara, I didn't know the extent of it. I was a fool, a blind, weak fool. But I wasn't a part of this, not this." He gestured to the papers in her hand. She looked up at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw past her own pain to the depths of his. He was a victim too, a different kind of victim, a more complicit one, but a victim nonetheless. He was a man raised in a cage so gilded he hadn't realized it was a cage until the door had slammed shut on him too. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice soft. He finally met her gaze, and his eyes were full of a terrible, broken clarity. "Because you were right. In the club, you said you pitied me, that I was hollowed out. You were right. They've been doing it my whole life. I never saw it. Not until you stood up to them. Not until I saw you walk out that door.
You were more of a Dubois in that moment than I have ever been." He took a shaky breath. "This," he said, pointing to the emails, "this is a weapon. You can give it to your lawyer. You can use it. It proves premeditation, malice. It gives you leverage for whatever you want." It was a confession. It was an act of treason against his own family. It was, in its own way, the bravest thing she had ever seen him do. He was handing her the knife and showing her where to stick it, even if it meant the blade would go through him to get to his father. A fragile, tentative truce began to form in the small, cluttered room. The animosity, the anger, the bitterness, it all receded, replaced by a shared, quiet moment of profound devastation. They were two people sitting in the wreckage of a life they had built together, a life that had been deliberately, maliciously destroyed by forces beyond their control. "Thank you, Julian," she said, and she meant it. He nodded, unable to speak. He looked around the room again, his gaze landing on the kitchen table, on the open pages of the Acorn Project proposal she had been studying. He walked over to it, drawn by a familiar ghost. "Is that?" he began. "Yes," she said. "I kept it." He reached out and gently touched the page with his notes on it, the one where he had called her idea the Ark. He stared at it for a long time, the silence stretching between them, thick with the weight of years and what-ifs. "We were good together, weren't we?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Before all of this, before them." "Yes," she said, her voice catching in her throat. "We were." For the first time that night, a genuine human connection sparked between them. It wasn't the passionate love of their youth or the comfortable companionship of their marriage. It was something new, something forged in the fires of a shared betrayal. It was a bond of two survivors. He turned from the table, his face a mask of regret. "I should go." "Julian, wait," she said, standing up. "Where will you go? Not back to the house?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "No, I don't think I can ever go back there. I have a room at a hotel downtown." He looked at her, his expression raw and vulnerable. "Elara, I am so sorry. For everything. For my weakness. For not protecting you. I will spend the rest of my life regretting it." The sincerity in his voice was a balm on a wound she didn't even know was still bleeding. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a solution, but it was an acknowledgement, a validation of her pain. She simply nodded. Words felt inadequate. He walked to the door, then turned back, his hand on the knob. "That," he said, gesturing back to the table, "don't let them dissolve it. It was your best idea. It was our best idea. It's worth fighting for." "I know," she said. He gave her one last, long, searching look, a look that held a decade of love and a world of regret. Then he opened the door and was gone. Elara stood in the silence, the damning email still in her hand. She walked back to the table, at the proposal, at her handwriting intertwined with his. They had been a team once, a powerful, brilliant team, and his family had seen that, and they had seen it as a threat. She carefully folded the email chain and placed it next to the original Acorn proposal, the proof of their beginning and the proof of their end. Together, they were more than just leverage. They were a story of love, betrayal, and now, perhaps, a story of redemption.
Healing, she realized, might be possible. But it wouldn't be a return to the way things were. It would have to be the creation of something entirely new, built from the strongest, most resilient parts of the wreckage. And for the first time, she felt a sliver of hope that they might, just might, be able to build it together. The days following Julian's late-night visit were a strange, fragile truce. He and Elara didn't meet again, but a new, unspoken line of communication had opened. He would send her encrypted, anonymous emails containing slivers of information, a market analysis of one of Acorn's holdings, a subtle warning about a legal tactic Whitlock and Finch was planning. They were breadcrumbs, small acts of treason that felt like offerings. It was his way of helping her fight a war against his own family, his penance delivered in kilobytes. With Julian's information and Anya's legal ferocity, Ilara was no longer just a woman with a grudge, she was a legitimate threat. Her counteroffer, full control of the Acorn Project in exchange for her silence on the sordid family matters, was met with a stony, furious silence from the Dubois camp. It was a stalemate, but one where Ilara, for the first time, was holding formidable ground. A quiet, dangerous hope began to grow in her heart, not just for victory, but for something more complex. She saw a glimmer of the man Julian used to be, and a future she hadn't dared to imagine began to take shape in the back of her mind. One where they might, someday, find their way back to each other, not as they were, but as two stronger, scarred people. It was this fragile hope that made the final shattering so complete. The call came from Julian himself. His voice was strained, tense. "Can you meet me? There's something has happened. Something you need to know. It's not safe to talk on the phone." He suggested a place she would never have expected, a small, forgotten city park nestled between two towering skyscrapers, a tiny patch of green in a concrete canyon. It was a neutral ground, a no-man's land belonging to neither of their worlds. When Ilara arrived, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the worn grass. Julian was already there, sitting on a bench, staring at a forlorn-looking fountain where pigeons were bathing. He looked exhausted, but also resolved, as if he had come to a difficult, painful decision. "Thank you for coming," he said, not looking at her. "What is it, Julian? What's happened?" she asked, sitting at the opposite end of the bench, a respectful distance between them. He took a deep breath. "My father knows," he said, his voice flat. "He doesn't have proof, not concrete proof, but he knows I'm the leak. He's cut off my access to the servers. He has people watching me. The walls are closing in." A chill went down Ilara's spine. "What does he want?" "He's done negotiating," Julian said. "He sees this as a personal betrayal. He's ready to scorch the earth. He's going to fight you, Ilara, not with money, but with destruction. He's authorized Whitlock to use everything. They'll create a smear campaign. They'll fabricate stories. They'll tie you up in court for the next decade until you and your foundation are bankrupt and your name is mud. He doesn't care about the Nightingale memo anymore. He's willing to take the hit just to make sure you're destroyed." The cold, brutal finality in his words was terrifying. This was the Richard Dubois she knew existed, the man who would burn his own kingdom to punish a dissenter. "He will ruin you," Julian continued, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were dark with a terrible sorrow. "And he will disinherit me. He will cut me off completely, dissolve my trust, remove me from the company. Everything. He will leave me with nothing." Ilara's heart ached for him. This was his greatest fear, realized, the thing he had sacrificed his own integrity and their marriage to avoid. "Julian, I'm so sorry." "Don't be," he said, a strange, hard edge to his voice. "It's what I deserve. But I'm not going to let him do it. I'm not going to let him destroy you." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single folded document. He handed it to her. It was not another piece of evidence. It was a statement, a confession. It was a sworn, notarized affidavit. In it, Julian took full responsibility for providing her with the confidential documents. He detailed his father's psychological abuse, his mother's manipulations, and the premeditated plot to replace Ilara. He confessed his own complicity and weakness. It was a suicide note for his former life. It was a document that would not only win Ilara her case, but would utterly decimate his father's reputation and his own future.
What is this? She whispered, her hands trembling as she held it.
It's my choice, he said. I'm giving it to you. You give this to your lawyer. You release it. It's over. You win. You get the Acorn Project. You get your justice. And I accept the consequences. It was the bravest, most selfless, most loving act she could have imagined. He was willing to sacrifice everything, his name, his fortune, his entire identity, to save her. The hope that had been a tiny flicker in her heart roared into a flame. This was the man. This was her Julian, resurrected from the ashes. Tears welled in her eyes. "Julian, no, I can't take this. I can't let you do this." "You have to," he insisted, his voice raw with emotion. "It's the only way. For once in my life, I am not going to be a coward. I am choosing you, Ilara. I am choosing what is right, no matter the cost." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated emotional connection. All the pain, all the betrayal seemed to melt away, leaving only the profound, earth-shattering truth of his sacrifice. She saw their future, a difficult but real one, laid out before them. They could start over. They could build something new from this wreckage. And that was when the second man stepped out from behind a large oak tree. It was Arthur Whitlock, his reptilian smile firmly in place. He held a small, professional-grade audio recorder. Ilara's blood ran cold. She looked from Whitlock's triumphant face to Julian's, and a horrifying, sickening realization dawned. Julian's expression had not changed. He was still looking at her with that same sad, resolute expression. He did not look surprised. He did not look panicked. He looked resigned. "I'm sorry, Ilara," Whitlock said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "I truly am. But you left us no choice." Ilara's mind struggled to catch up. She looked at the sworn statement in her hands, then back at Julian. It was a prop. The whole thing was a performance, a trap. "Julian?" she whispered, the single word a question, a plea, a denial. He finally broke eye contact, staring at the ground. "He was going to destroy us both," he said, his voice a dead monotone. This was the only way. A clean break. What are you talking about?" she stammered, the world tilting on its axis. Whitlock stepped forward. "My dear Miss Mathis, what you have just been a party to is a textbook case of coercion and extortion. You have been pressuring my client, a man in a fragile emotional state, to act against his own interests and the interests of his family. This recording," he said, holding up the device, "captures you accepting a legally sensitive document from him, a document he was clearly not in a sound state of mind to offer. You took advantage of him. Any judge, any board of directors will see it that way. The cold, legal words were a physical assault. He was twisting Julian's sacrifice into a crime she had committed. But..." Ilara looked at Julian, her heart shattering into a million tiny pieces. You said you were choosing me." And then came the killing blow. Julian looked up at her, and his eyes were empty. The warmth, the sorrow, the connection, it was all gone, replaced by the cold, familiar gray of a Dubois. "I am choosing my family," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I am a Dubois. That is my first and only loyalty. I made a mistake getting involved with you. It was a weakness. My father has made me see that. It was a betrayal so complete, so absolute, it dwarfed everything that had come before. The dinner, the replacement, the lies, all of it was nothing compared to this. He had taken her hope,
the most precious and fragile thing she had, and he had used it as bait. He had orchestrated this elaborate, cruel piece of theater to break her completely. "We have a final offer for you," Whitlock continued smoothly, as if he were discussing the weather. "A one-time, non-negotiable payment, significantly less than what was previously on the table. You will take it, you will sign a comprehensive NDA, and you will relinquish all claims to the Acorn Project. If you refuse, this recording, along with a mountain of other evidence we have compiled about your character, will be made public. Your foundation will be investigated. You will lose everything." Ilara couldn't breathe. She looked at Julian, searching for any flicker of the man who had sat with her in Maya's apartment, the man who had looked at their old proposal with such regret. There was nothing. He was a stranger, a hollow man in an expensive suit. She had been right all along. They had hollowed him out, and now he had just helped them to hollow out what was left of her heart.
She dropped the affidavit as if it were on fire. She backed away from them, shaking her head, a silent guttural sound of pure agony caught in her throat. She had never felt so alone, so utterly and completely broken. They hadn't just won. They had made her a willing participant in her own destruction. She turned and ran. She ran from the park, from the city, from the ghost of a future she had foolishly allowed herself to believe in. She ran until her lungs burned, and the sound of her own shattered heart was the only thing she could hear. The world after the park was gray. Ilara moved through it like a phantom, the vibrant colors of her defiance and hope bleached out by the sheer, brutal white light of Julian's ultimate betrayal. She went back to Maya's apartment, packed her single suitcase, and left without a word. She couldn't bear to face Maya's kindness, her optimism. She couldn't bear to explain how she had allowed her heart to be used as a weapon against her. She took the settlement. It felt like accepting payment for her own soul, but she was too broken to fight anymore. They had won. Richard, Genevieve, and Julian, the unholy trinity, had succeeded in grinding her down to nothing. The money was transferred to her account, a string of meaningless numbers. She signed their ironclad NDA, the pen feeling like a block of ice in her hand. Every word was a nail in the coffin of her justice, her dignity. The war was over. She had lost. She bought a ticket for a train heading west, with no destination in mind. For weeks she drifted. She stayed in cheap, anonymous motels in towns whose names she immediately forgot. She ate at lonely diners, staring out the window at lives that were not hers. The fire that had fueled her was gone, leaving only the cold, bitter ash of defeat. She was a ghost haunting the edges of America, a woman who had been systematically erased. The person who saved her was a 10-year-old girl named Sophia in a dusty library in a small town in rural Colorado. Ilara had taken refuge in the library one afternoon, not to read, but simply to be in a place that was quiet and expected nothing of her. She watched as Sophia struggled to read a book aloud to her younger brother, her brow furrowed in concentration, stumbling over the words. The librarian was busy, the parents distracted, and without thinking, Ilara found herself kneeling by the little girl's side. "That's a tricky one," she said softly, pointing to a word. "Sometimes it helps if you break it down into smaller pieces." For the next hour she sat with Sophia, her voice quiet and patient, her finger tracing the lines of the story. She taught her the same simple phonetic tricks she had taught hundreds of kids through her foundation. And as Sophia's reading grew more confident, as her voice began to fill with the magic of the story, something inside Ilara, something she thought was dead and buried, began to stir. A tiny, flickering ember. She had forgotten who she was. She was not just the woman who had been wronged by the Dubois family. She was Ilara Mathis, the daughter of a librarian,
the woman who believed a story could save a soul. They had taken her company, her husband, her pride, but they could not take this. This was hers. That night in her sterile motel room, she opened her laptop for the first time in weeks. She didn't look at her bank account. She didn't look at the news. She began to write. She wrote a business plan, a new one. It was for a foundation, but smaller, leaner, more agile. A mobile literacy initiative called the Sparrow Project, designed to bring books and tutoring to the most remote, underserved communities in the country. She would use their blood money to fuel it. She would take the poison they had fed her and turn it into medicine. It was a choice. She could remain a ghost, or she could choose to live. She chose to live. Meanwhile, back in the steel and glass canyons of the city, Julian was living in his own kind of hell. He had won. He had secured his family's legacy, protected his inheritance, and was now being groomed to take over as CEO, with Isabel, the perfect corporate wife, at his side. He had everything he had ever been programmed to want, and he was suffocating. The memory of Ilara's face in the park, the dawning horror, the absolute soul-shattering devastation, was a brand on his soul. It was his first thought in the morning and his last thought at night. He had played his part perfectly. He had delivered the lines his father and Arthur Whitlock had fed him. He had been the dutiful son, the cold, calculating Dubois. But the recording of that encounter, the one Whitlock had made, had captured more than just Ilara's coercion. It had captured Julian's performance. And every time he thought of it, every time he remembered the words he had spoken, a piece of him died.
He had told her he was choosing his family. I am a Dubois. That is my first and only loyalty. The lie was a corrosive acid, eating away at him from the inside. His relationship with Isabel was a hollow pantomime. They attended galas, hosted dinners, and smiled for the cameras. She was flawless, efficient, and utterly devoid of the warmth, the passion, the brilliant, messy humanity he had loved and destroyed in Ilara. In private, they were two polite, exquisitely dressed strangers living in the cavernous, silent mansion that was no longer a home, but a mausoleum for his heart. The breaking point came during a board meeting. His father, Richard, was outlining a new, aggressive strategy to acquire a rival company. It was a ruthless, predatory plan that would result in thousands of layoffs. Richard spoke of the employees not as people, but as redundancies, as unfortunate but necessary collateral damage. And as Julian sat there, in his rightful seat at the great mahogany table, he looked at his father's cold, impassive face, and he finally saw him for what he was, a black hole, consuming everything around him, a man who saw human beings as nothing more than figures on the balance sheet. He saw his own future, a long, empty corridor of power and profit, and it was unbearable. He thought of the affidavit, the one he had let Ilara believe was a prop. It wasn't. He had written it, every word, in a fit of genuine, desperate love and remorse. He had been fully prepared to sacrifice himself for her. He had gone to the park that day to give it to her, to set her free. It was his father who had turned it into a trap. Richard, having learned of Julian's plan from a PI he'd had tailing him, had confronted him an hour before the meeting. He had not raged. He had done something far worse. He had laid out the cold, hard choice. "You can play the martyr," he'd said, "and I will destroy you both. Or you can do your duty, save this family, and crush her. Prove to me, once and for all, that you are my son." He had given Julian the script, the strategy. He had forced him to turn his act of love into an act of ultimate betrayal. And Julian, in a final, tragic moment of weakness, had capitulated. Now, sitting in the boardroom, he knew he couldn't live with that choice anymore. He stood up. The room fell silent. "No," he said. Richard stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say?"
I said, "No," Julian repeated, his voice clear and strong, filled with an authority that didn't come from his title, but from a broken heart that was finally healing. "We are not doing this. We're not gutting a company and destroying thousands of lives for the sake of a few more percentage points on our stock price." He looked around the table at the stunned faces of the board members. "For years, I have done my duty. I have followed the path laid out for me. I have upheld the values of this family." He looked directly at his father. "But our values are corrupt. We have become a company that prizes profit over people, power over principle, and image over integrity." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed a button, and from the phone's small speaker, a recording began to play. It was the conversation from the park, but it wasn't Whitlock's edited version. It was the full, unedited recording from a second device Julian had secretly had in his own pocket. The board heard it all. They heard Julian's initial desperate plea. They heard his genuine offer of sacrifice. They heard the raw emotion in his voice as he said, "I am choosing you, Ilara." And then they heard Arthur Whitlock's voice and the sickening, horrifying shift as the trap was sprung. They heard the cruelty. They heard the coercion. They heard the truth. When it was over, the silence in the room was absolute. "I was a coward," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I let my father manipulate me into betraying the best person I have ever known. But that ends today." He looked at his father, his eyes blazing with a fire Ilara would have recognized. "I am not you. I resign from this board and from this family. Effective immediately." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a legacy of ruin. He didn't know what he would do or where he would go. He only knew one thing. He had to find Ilar. Not to ask for forgiveness, he knew he hadn't earned that, but to tell her the truth, and to dedicate what was left of his life to trying to become a man worthy of her memory. 6 months later, Ilara was in a remote corner of New Mexico. The Sparrow Project's converted bookmobile was parked outside a small community center, the setting sun painting the desert sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple.
She was sitting on the steps of the van, laughing with a group of children, their faces illuminated by the glow of the books in their laps. She was happy. It was a quiet, hard-won happiness, but it was real. A dusty, unassuming pickup truck pulled up and parked a short distance away. A man got out. He was thinner than she remembered, dressed in simple jeans and a work shirt. His face was weathered by the sun. It was Julian. Her heart didn't leap, it didn't ache, it simply stilled. She watched as he approached, slowly, tentatively, as if he were approaching a wild, easily startled creature. He stopped a respectful 20 feet away. "Ilara," he said, his voice quiet. The children looked from him to her, their eyes wide with curiosity. "It's okay," she told them gently. "He's an old friend." She stood up and walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. "What are you doing here, Julian?" "I came to bring you this," he said. He held out a thick manila envelope. "It's everything. The full recording. The board meeting minutes. My father has been forced to step down. The company is changing. And this," he said, holding out a second, smaller envelope, "is for you." She took it. Inside was a single share certificate. It made her the majority owner of the Acorn Project, which had been fully spun off, just as she had demanded. And there was a handwritten note. "I know 'sorry' is a worthless word. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to have the truth. And I wanted you to have what was always rightfully yours. The Ark is in your hands now. Be happy, Ilara. You've earned it more than anyone I know." She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw no trace of the Dubois heir, no ghost of the coward. She just saw Julian, a man who had lost everything to find himself. "Thank you," she said, and the words were simple, but they held a universe of meaning. "I've been working on a ranch about 50 miles from here," he said, a faint, wry smile on his face. "Turns out I'm good with my hands when they're not tied. I heard about a bookmobile in the area. I had to see." He didn't ask to be a part of her life. He didn't ask for a second chance. He just stood there, offering her the truth and her victory, expecting nothing in return. And in that moment, Ilara made a final choice. The story didn't have to end with them apart. It could be the beginning of a new one, a different one built not on youthful promises and inherited power, but on hard-won truth, profound respect, and the quiet, resilient strength of two people who had been through the fire and found their way back, not to who they were, but to who they were always meant to be. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, the first one she had ever truly given him. "Well," she said, gesturing to the bookmobile, where the children were beginning to pack up, "I could always use a driver." His face broke into a smile of such overwhelming, incredulous relief and joy that it was like watching the sun rise over the desert. He had taken back his soul. She had taken back her life. And together, quietly, they had taken back everything that mattered. The past casts long shadows, but even the longest shadows disappear when you finally step into the sun. What do you think is the hardest part of true forgiveness? Letting go of the pain or learning to trust again? Let us know your thoughts on this journey in the comments below. Thanks for joining today and staying to the end. See you tomorrow. Don't forget to subscribe.